Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Hogan Campus Center, the College of the Holy Cross. My name is Tom Landy. I'm the director of the Reverend Michael C. McFarland S.J. Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture. I love saying that whole thing in one breath here at Holy Cross. It's my real privilege to welcome and introduce Mary McAleese, the former president of Ireland. I'd also like to welcome Mary's husband, Martin McAleese, who's here. He had a career as an accountant and a dentist and eventually took him to the Irish Senate. Perhaps it's his role there and in the Senate that helped the Senate survive its recent vote to eliminate its existence. But it's great to have them both here and to have a chance to talk to both of them. They have some interesting opinions that don't always agree on Irish politics, so it makes some good points of discussion. Our lecture tonight is part of the Deichmann Family Lectures on Religion and Modernity, and I'd especially like to thank John Deichmann and his family, who have made possible a number of these lectures, this series, and really have enriched our lives at Holy Cross. Our guest tonight, Mary McAleese, led Ireland during a time of remarkable transition through a very long tenure, 1997 to 2001. It's an extraordinary legacy of leadership for any president, and it corresponds to a remarkable period of time and change in Ireland, including the economic modernization known as the Celtic Tiger, and also the time of economic hardship that followed, or a part of it. It was a time of intense change and disruption in the Catholic Church as well, and we'll probably say more about that in a few minutes. I visited Ireland recently for the first time since I was 21, which is to say 10 years ago, and had a chance to experience firsthand some of those remarkable changes in Ireland, how remarkable they've been. I told people I was like Rip Van Winkle waking up after a dream of, 30-something years. And they all told me, for them, it was like waking up in a dream, to be in a very different place than they were in 30 years ago. A Catholic from Belfast in Northern Ireland, Mary McAleese earned a law degree from the Queen's University of Belfast. She became a barrister and then was appointed Reed Professor of Criminal Law, Criminology, and Penology at Trinity College, Dublin. She later served as director of the Institute of Professional Legal Studies at Queen's University, where she became the university's first female pro-vice chancellor. In 1997, she was elected the first Northern Irish native and the second woman president of Ireland, apparently the first woman in history to succeed another woman as president of a country. She used her time in office to promote justice, social equality, social inclusion, anti-sectarianism, and reconciliation. With the theme of building bridges, she advocated for an end to the violence in Ireland that had plagued her childhood and had forced her family from their North Belfast home. In 1998, the Good Friday Agreement was adopted, making institutional changes to the government structure of Northern Ireland and addressing the relationship between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and between the Republic of Ireland and Great Britain. She earned high approval ratings and was re-elected to a second term without opposition in 2004. In 2011, she hosted Queen Elizabeth II. It was the first state visit by a British monarch to the Republic of Ireland, and many have hailed it as the greatest achievement of her peace-building presidency. Since the end of her presidency, Mary McAleese has not been resting on her laurels. Even while she was president, by the way, she was taking courses at the Milltown Institute. We have a couple Jesuits from Milltown here tonight. After that, she began to pursue a licentiate degree in canon law from the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, and authored a book titled Quo Vadis, Collegiality and the Code of Canon Law, published earlier this year by Columba Press. That book is the occasion for tonight's event, and much of our discussion will turn to that work, but we'll move from there. In that book, she notes, quote, that this book was written by one of Christ's faithful to the pastors of the church and to others of Christ's faithful. Mary has been both critical and helped us think our way through, and also approach that really as a person of very deep faith. Tonight, Mary McAleese combines her experience in civil law and governance with her study of canon law, that is, church law, in line with her consistent vision of bridge building, to a discussion of how authority might be more effectively shared in the future governance of the church. It's a discussion about what we call, in theological circles, or canonical circles, collegiality. Mary McAleese and I first planned this event a year ago in a very different ecclesial context. At the time, many of us, I dare say, including many bishops and cardinals, were losing hope about the Second Vatican Council's promise of collegiality. Yet today, collegiality is a hallmark of Pope Francis' papacy and of the things that he said he stands about. And indeed, it appears a key impetus for his election. I look forward to talking more about that with her tonight. Another thing that's different from a year ago, but I want to give Mary, both of us, credit. I will say that we were both very on spot and deserve really congratulations for it. That is, even though we planned this event 1 year ago, we did have the foresight to choose the night between the two games when the Red Sox were playing in the World Series. And I think that was truly prescient. The format of tonight's discussion is different than usual. At Mary McAleese's suggestion, my colleague, Professor Paige Reynolds, and I will pose some questions to her about the work that she's done in Quo Vadis on canon law and collegiality, and help us think about the context in which she writes. Professor Reynolds is an expert on Irish theater. We won't talk too much about Irish theater, but I know that she is well connected in terms of Irish life and culture, and theater has a tremendous relevance on Irish life as well, and is a good guide to the Irish scene. After our discussion, there will be time for questions from the audience and for book signing afterwards. I will note that questions, when it comes to that, will only be taken from the microphone at the center. Unless there are any accessibility issues, let me know otherwise. Meanwhile, please join me in welcoming Mary McAleese.
Good evening, everybody. How are you? You well? I hope you're going to improve over the course of the next hour or so, then. Looking forward to this discussion.
I know you'll
I'm in your hands now.
So you've written a book about collegiality, and I'm sure that you mean more than happy fellow feeling between people, especially in that it involves canon law. Can you tell us a little bit about what it means beyond the vague desire to work together and be happy?
I'll tell you where I'm coming to it from. I'm a cradle Catholic, born in Belfast, a sectarian city, grew up through the Troubles. My husband and I both lived in families where we lost our homes as a result of the Troubles. We're part of that cohort of young Catholics, described memorably by Seamus Heaney as intelligence as brightened and unmannerly as crowbars. The first educated generation of young Catholics. And for us, our faith was part of an intrinsic part of our identity. Our church was strong. Our church was our comfort. When we realized that we were regarded as second class, it was our champion, our advocate. And we were living through the times of Vatican II, where the great intellectual foment in the world seemed to be focused in and around the Catholic Church. We were proud to be Catholics. And then something happened in recent years, and I discovered that my pride was ebbing away. It was leaching away for a whole variety of reasons. The glacial pace of ecumenism, the failure to recognize women in the church, the failure to be champions of other marginalized groups like gay people in the church, the dreadful, awful events of clerical sex abuse and episcopal neglect. All of these things and many more conduce to a situation where I found myself facing old age, doubting the integrity of this part of my life that was so important to me. And the lawyer in me started to ask questions about, well, there is clearly dysfunction here. There is a big disconnect. The laity, who should have been so exercised and energized by Vatican II, were now feeling left out, overlooked, neglected. In the civic space, we had miles of empty space in which to talk and debate. In the ecclesiastical space, we had no place in which to talk. And so I decided that I wanted to study canon law to see, was there anything in canon law that I could use, that I could make a tool that I could, in a sense, help my church. And governance seemed to me to be a very important issue. At a very simple level, I felt and still feel that we are in a church where people talk down to us and there is very little listening up. And I wanted to know structurally, why was that? Why is that? That everything seems to cascade from the top down, but this massive, massive plinth of 1.2 billion people don't seem to have the chance to talk up. And I looked at the structure and examined the structure of the church and found, of course, that collegiality, which had been one of the big buzzwords of Vatican II, by which was meant exactly that, a church that was going to listen up, that was going to create structures whereby the church would be in a massive dialogue, an ongoing, refreshing dialogue. It would no longer be this autocratic body of a small group at the top, rather like a feudal court, deciding in private and in secret things that would have huge impact on my life and your life and everybody else's life, but rather would be a listening church that would encourage debate. And so for me, at Vatican II, collegiality meant a number of things, but in particular what it meant, in particular, and what my book is about essentially, is about a change in the structure of governance so that this body that we call the College of Bishops, that is all the bishops of the world, would be given the opportunity to help the Pope govern. Now, they wouldn't tell him what to do, but before he did anything, he'd have to listen to them. And that they would have an opportunity to have their point of view put across. And the theme of the book, if there is a theme, simply is that if the College of Bishops had been given that role, which was the intended role at Vatican II spoke. In fact, one of the biggest debates in Vatican II and the most difficult debates was on this subject of the collegiality, the role of the College of Bishops. They had just decided for the first time in church history that the College of Bishops was of divine origin, that the bishops were not legates of the Pope, they were appointed by Christ, by God. And so they had co-responsibility for governance of the church along with the Pope. And the Pope was, yes, a primatial ruler, but alongside primatialism was the College of Bishops, of which he was head, and they had the same capacity as he had to govern the church. And they could exercise that in a number of ways, at a Vatican Council, for example, or in ways that the Pope could devise. Regrettably, he has never devised any such ways since then. So we were left with all this promise of a College of Bishops that was now going to become effectively involved in governance. And my view then was, my argument is, that the bishops, since they are located right around the world in all their various constituencies and close to their people, that if they were involved in a regular basis on advising the Pope on church governance in an effective way, they would also have to bring to those debates the views of their people. They would be asking us, well, what should I be saying on this subject? Maybe it's women in the church, or maybe it is the family, but whatever it would be. And that there would be then this lively debate, not asking that the laity would co-govern the church. That's the role of the College of Bishops, that they would co-govern with the Pope. And the Pope, of course, would always have the final right of veto. That is his right. But that further down the line, we would be asked our opinions and channels would be created for our point of view. I live in Ireland, and we've never had a diocesan synod. We've never had a national synod. Remarkable. These are two of the structures that were created for so-called debate, but they're only useful if you use them. And actually, even then, if you use them, they're not that useful because, as they're structured, they don't allow you to raise anything that would disagree with the magisterium. So that's why we don't have any, because people say, what's the point? And yet, I looked at the Code of Canon Law, and I saw that under Canon 212.3, it says to me openly, that as a member of the Christa Fidelis, as a member of the people of God, I have a right, but also a duty to draw to the attention of my sacred pastors any opinion that I might have that I think is for the good of the church. Did anybody ever tell you that? Quite a few bishops don't know it either. And here was this wonderful gem just sitting there, and I thought that it was time that I used it. And so I wrote the book on collegiality, which, for me anyway, was one way of saying to my church that going forward we need to change the structure of governance. It is no longer tenable to have one man notionally run everything, because we know what has happened is that one man can't run everything, so the curia think they run it for him. So we have a curia that is a government when it shouldn't be. They're supposed to be a civil service. They also are administrators, and they are also a judicial forum. This is, everywhere you look, there are overlapping conflicts of interest that are not healthy. We who live in democracies, we expect that these functions will be separated. We talk about the separation of powers, not because we like the idea of keeping things in neat little boxes, but because there are very good reasons that these particular powers should not overlap, that they should be kept separate. What we have not done really in the Catholic Church, regrettably, is we have not subjected these structures to the kind of really insightful intellectual probing and measurement that will tell us whether they are effective or not. But we who are on the ground, many of us can see how ineffective they are and how poorly they now serve us today. We've seen it through the abuse issues that was very evident during to us in Ireland as we dealt with serial clerical abuse, but also, importantly, very serial bad governance and bad decision making by bishops. That we really were we were the victims of a very poor structure, a poor governance structure. And I have to say I'm very, very encouraged by what Pope Francis has said on these things. These are among the first issues that he dealt with. He raised the issue of collegiality and the need for it. He's raised the issue of curial reform. He raised the issue of the Synod of Bishops. It had been the hope of Vatican II, or of some at Vatican II, that the Synod of Bishops would become a body that would help co-govern the Church. But as those of you who are observers of Vatican II will know, on the night that they were discussing the Synod of Bishops, Pope Paul VI surprised, shocked those gathered at Vatican II by announcing the creation of a Synod of Bishops. And that was not a creation of the Vatican Council, but a creation of the Pope. It was a body that would meet. Allegedly, it was supposed to meet on a regular basis. It has met intermittently. But it was a body to which he gave no decision-making powers. And I was very, very, I must say, I was really thrilled to hear Pope Francis more or less write it off and say that the Synod was pretty much a worthless exercise and in need of significant reform. And he drew attention to the form of synodality that they have in the Orthodox Church, which is much more inclusive, much more probing, much more probative, and much more directed towards collective, collaborative decision-making. So on that front, I think you're right, the temper has changed in a year. A year ago when I wrote the book, I had no expectation that collegiality was ever going to come on the agenda, except where two or more were gathered to criticise the Church as usual. But at the top level it would be ignored, and I was really heartened by what I heard from Francis, because he's obviously a man who has been listening in his diocese.
Maybe stay with the book a little bit. We have some broader questions that maybe will come to. But a naive question. So if this, the letter killed the conspiracy of life, why hope for canon law as a source of change? Why look to legal structures? There are many people who say, look, we've got the Gospels. What kind of church needs laws and regulations? Where do you find hope in them? And I know you're a lawyer and you decided to work.
Yeah. I think it's a good question. I really don't have a terribly intelligent answer for it, except that we're 1.2 billion people in the Church, and it probably would be too naive to think that we could organise ourselves without any laws except the Great Commandment to love one another, though frankly at times it's very attractive. So do we need canon law? I'm sure we could probably live without it, a large part of it. A lot of it is, is drainingly dreary. Yes, but having said that, I look at that Canon 212.3 that nobody ever heard tell of, and I think back to an episode that happened way back 20 years ago, a group called Brothers and Sisters in Christ, BASIC for short. It's a body that lobbies for women in priesthood, women in the diaconate. They gathered together, they did a survey in Ireland, and as a result of that survey, they came up with the opinion of, this was an opinion of mass-going Catholics. It seemed to suggest support for women deacons and women in priesthood, and they sent a letter with that information to the then Cardinal Daly in Armagh. He's dead, gone to his eternal reward, now God rest him, where the letter's still waiting for him, I'm sure. Because what he did was he sent the letter back. He sent the letter back and said he wasn't empowered to read it. Now, just think about that for a moment, because Canon 212 says we're entitled to let our sacred pastors know our views. But what he was saying, yes, but the only views I want to hear are the views we've already made our minds up on. And if you're challenging our views, we don't want to hear those. That's not what the canon says. So in other words, there's been a kind of a creeping cowardice around canon law. And you can see why. I mean, over the papacies of John Paul and Benedict, we had a very considerable, if you like, corralling of Catholic theological faculties and Catholic academics who were discouraged from challenging the magisterium of the Church. And that's all part and parcel of it. I read Canon 212 differently. No doubt had I been a cleric who went through the formal everyday canon law training, I might have disregarded Canon 212, but I'm lucky. I'm a lay person. I'm one of those awfully stupid lay people, and I haven't been through the process of formation that allows you to be blind to certain things. And I've been a civil lawyer, and so I am quite happy to argue the toss about what the words mean. Someone, a canon lawyer, said to me, well, you can't go around using that because you can only use it in terms of the structures that are created, like the diocesan synods and the national synods. And I said, how long do I have to wait for one of those? Never had one of those in Ireland, ever. Never had one of them. So that's not what the words say. So, canon lawyers will argue, and I thought that I might throw my argument. I would become a canon lawyer so that they couldn't ignore me anymore, that I might actually possibly have some impact, particularly around this debate about Canon 212.3, and encourage people to use it, because this is where this great plinth. I mean, if you can imagine, the Catholic Church is rather like, just take a look at this, this podium. It's like a gigantic big plinth. Most of us are we're in the plinth somewhere, and then there is this in the middle. There's this. Move it over here. That's the hierarchy and the clergy, that tiny little group that runs everything. And I disappear from that. I'm nowhere. Why do I disappear from that? Because I'm a woman. I'm just down here among and most of us are. And this group, this tiny little spike, this is the place where all the decisions are made. They are predicated upon ordination, upon holy orders. And the further you go up the line, the smaller and smaller it gets, and the more elite becomes the group who make decisions. Now, I don't have any problem about having bosses who make decisions. I've been one of those before, And every so often you have to say, like you say to your kids, excuse me, God did not make me your best friend, he made me your mother. And every so often you have to say, right, I've heard what you had to say, I'm the boss, and we're not doing that. So I understand that, and I don't have a problem. I don't have a problem with governance, and I don't have a problem with decision-making per se. What I have a big problem with is what feeds the decision-making process. What feeds it? What narratives are going into it? Whose voices are being heard? Where is this body here sucking the information up from? And I'm telling you, it's not getting down to here. It's not. There's an awful lot of stuff going on up here, talking among themselves, and not drawing up from this vast, wonderful, grace-filled, experience-filled resource that is 1.2 billion people. who are talking vociferously about many issues to do with the church in the public sphere, in the civil sphere, but have no space in the ecclesiastical sphere in which to let these views be heard. So, if you like, the rest of my life, I'm in retirement now, and I have made it my business to try and see, are there spaces within the structure of my church that will help to release this great pressure of frustration that is driving a lot of people out of the church, that is turning people off the church, that is making people like me waking up in the morning and say, just give me the strength, God, to stay one more day. To hang on by my fingernails, because I still love this institution. You know, it still is it's still my spiritual home, and I don't want to leave it, and I certainly don't want to be driven from it. But I do want to see it function in a much less dysfunctional way. So the lawyer in me will always want to use the law. Just back in 1969, before I became a law student, I came home on the night that I discovered I was getting into law school, and the first of my family ever to go to university. I was out celebrating that, and I came home, and my parish was on fire, in flames. And that was the night that I stood and watched as men in uniform, members of a police auxiliary force called the B Specials, stood and burnt Catholic homes in my parish. And I watched them do it. Now, you can get very angry about those things, and a lot of people did. And because we have a culture of paramilitarism, a lot of people who got angry, people of my generation, joined paramilitary organizations. They made those choices. I had the same questions in my mind, and I decided that actually I believed in this gospel to love one another. I was going to try and find forgiveness, but I was also going to try and find ways, democratic ways, constitutional ways, no matter how tight they were, no matter how small the spaces, I was going to try and find those spaces and worry them open. And that's why I became a lawyer. And I've never regretted that. I've always been very glad that somewhere there was somebody praying for me, that I didn't make the choice and choose the paramilitary route of violence. And I think when I look at the Good Friday Agreement now, signed in 1998, that underpins our peace process, it's a vindication of law. It's a vindication of negotiation and compromise, yes. But as it has unfurled over these years since 1998, it's been clear to me that the legal infrastructure which guarantees parity of esteem to everybody in a very divided community is absolutely essential. In other words, the legal infrastructure is what holds the community together, particularly during tough times, when a lot of other things fall away, like the emotion, the lovely emotion on the day after the Good Friday Agreement, when we were all happy, clappy and loving one another. That lasted about 3 days. And then it was back to porridge, you know, and fighting and arguing, and somebody gets blown up or somebody gets killed and everybody wants to not talk anymore. But this document held us together and forced us to keep working together. And so I think it's a bit like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You know, no government gives rights to its people. It protects their God-given rights. But we still needed that document. We still needed that document in the 1940s, coming out of 2 world wars, to remind us that right around the world, human beings believed that they had a right to human dignity and a right to human rights. And we needed that document to be signed up to by all the countries around the world, so that when they were bold or bad, we had something to hold them to account to. And so for me, canon law is that. It's the legal infrastructure. It's something that we can use to hold people to account. If it's imperfect, we can change it and argue for change. It's been drastically underused. Regrettably, most canon lawyers, I'm studying with canon lawyers, most of these young priests will end up in diocesan chancelleries, where they will deal more or less exclusively either with marriage or with issues to do with clerics leaving or being reprimanded. So they have never had time to study Canon 212.3, but I've loads of time. I've loads of time. I have nothing else but time now. So I'm going to study that, and I'm going to ram it down their throats until they hear it, frankly, because I think it needs to be said and it needs to be done, and we need to find a space for these voices.
20 years ago, I remember Ladislas Arce, the Jesuit canon.
I love that man.
Making the argument precisely that canon law was the best place. 20 years ago, it seemed easier to believe. But you've pried open some of those spaces in the book, in current canon law. But at another level, when we look at it, papacy is a monarchy, and the relationship between law and monarchy is kind of fuzzy. We're lucky in some ways to have the Pope who we have now, but he's 76, he won't live forever. So how do we think about this? Is this about creating more and better canon law, moving it a step beyond your book, about a whole different model of papacy? How do we do it beyond?
I think we need to. I think that just sticking with the issue, Ladislas Arce is a gem. He's just wonderful. He's my hero. He's my canon law hero. And he tells us about Vatican II. His words about Vatican II are, it's a slow burn. And that's very interesting, because a lot of us think the fire has gone out. But he reminds us that it's a slow burn, as indeed were all Vatican councils. A slow burn. And that's worth remembering, particularly when we come to answer this question about the structure of the current primatial structure of the Church, and where that might be leading us. Vatican II set up two models of church governance. One, it said the Church is primatial, the Pope is the boss. But it also said the College of Bishops has also powers of governance. And it never really reconciled how those two would fit together. So it's on the one hand primatial, and at the same time running in parallel, it is collegial. What happened at Vatican II was they all came together, 2,500 bishops. They had a great rip-roaring discussion. They came up with grand documents, and then they all went back to their countries and left absolutely nobody charged with the job of carrying forward and putting into consolidated practice what they had just agreed, and in particular trying to figure out this connection between the primatialism of the Pope and the collegiality of the College of Bishops. How were they going to work together? And so when the new Code of Canon Law, which was constructed after Vatican II and was designed to draw Vatican II into the new code, they had been given no clear guidance by the Vatican II or since Vatican II. So what you get in the Code of Canon Law is it says, well, on the one hand, the Pope's entitled to govern. On the other hand, the College of Bishops, they're also entitled to govern, but here are the ways in which they can govern. At a Vatican Council, which will be called by the Pope. Second way they can govern is if the Pope decides to let them govern in any way that he so decides, and he never has. And the third way is scattered throughout the world if they come to a common position on something which they have never done. There's now 4,500 of them. The chances of ever getting a common position on anything are getting remoter by the minute. But on the other hand, easier by the minute are global communications. The idea of them all having to come to Rome every 5 minutes to be involved in governance is not necessarily the case anymore. We have now got wonderful means of technological communication that make things much easier. Plus, of course, we can think of bodies like the Synod of Bishops, which could be regarded at some stage as a formal, if you like, subcommittee with decision-making powers, obviously always subject to the Pope's power of veto. But the point about this is, I think for the future, it's about trying to find some way, not just about talking about primatialism or collegiality. How do we broaden the source of discourse? How do we get new voices into the narratives from which information is being drawn? For example, how do we get a fresh debate on women in the Church? Who's going to have that debate? We're having a Synod of Bishops meet very shortly on the family. Hilarious. How many of them have got families? You know, as a quiet, seriously, just think about it. How many bishops have wives and children?
And we hope.
Do not answer that question. Seriously. I look at it and I say to myself, does anybody have the remotest idea how ridiculous this looks? Just how ridiculous this looks. And I want to know then, from what sources will they draw? And I want that to be open so that the sources that they draw from, and believe me, I've been among those sources in the past, are not just what I might call the simpering courtiers who are going to tell them back what they want to hear, but people who might actually fill their ideas and their ideas box with new ideas. Fill their ideas box with things that we're talking about in the civic space, and fill their ideas box with the kind of information they need to have to make good decisions that will impact on families for the next God knows how many generations.
The last time they tried that was two committees on Humanae Vitae.
Yes, and look what happened then. I actually think that Humanae Vitae was pretty much a watershed for the church. Not just we've talked about the impact of the clerical sex abuse in Ireland and the subsequent realisation that our bishops had made appalling errors of judgment, and remarkably had done so consistently, even though they said they never talked to each other. And I find personally that really a conundrum that I still have not had satisfactorily explained. How come bishops routinely confronted with abusers, routinely moved priests, and yet tell us that they never discussed among themselves what they would do, that there was no conspiracy to do this, that there was no, and yet there's a pattern of them doing the same things. And that tells me that in fact a very small coterie were devising answers to problems. In our own case, for example, in Ireland, one of the reasons why I decided to study canon law was in the wake of a report called the Murphy Report, which was scathing about canon law, absolutely scathing. It said that in not one single case of the abuse cases that came before the Murphy Tribunal, this was a state tribunal investigating clerical abuse in Ireland. In not one single case had canon law been used to assist a victim. Not one. It's an awful, damning indictment. And it went on to point the finger at a man called Father Gerard Sheehy, Monsignor Gerard Sheehy, who was the top canon lawyer in Ireland. He's since dead at the time. And it turned out that while the bishops mightn't have talked to each other, they all went to the same person for advice. And he gave them the same advice. And it was very bad advice. He gave them two pieces of advice. Ignore civil law and ignore canon law. Two very bad pieces of advice. And so here were people not necessarily talking to each other, or indeed widening the base from which they took their advice, but going to one figure whose advice was toxic, frankly. And that probably was replicated in other areas. Why? Because he was one of a very small coterie of canon lawyers who were advising on the new Code of Canon Law. And they were all talking among themselves and giving the same advice, many of them, regrettably around the world, which is why we get what looks like a conspiracy but actually isn't. It's just that too small a group of people are being asked for their very, very, very important and seminal advice. So my worry is for the church for the future is to break open that closedness, so that we are a church that truly listens. I mean, can I put it to you this way? I honestly never mind losing an argument. Never, ever mind losing an argument, as long as we can have the argument. And I think that's where the church needs to get to, a position of saying, let's have all the information on the table. We're not going to agree, we may very well disagree, but at least we will know that everything that could be said, should be said, has been said. And then minds get made up. Minds get made up not with the information that has come from people whom you chose specially so that they would only give you what you wanted to hear, but that you heard the full realm of information. And we are not at that stage yet, but Pope Francis looks like a man who might be interested in doing that. He has certainly served up a very, very interesting dish of tapas. And I'm just really looking forward to the dinner that he's going to serve now.
That's sort of leads to the question that I wanted to ask. Because one of the things that I find so exciting about the way that you're talking about the church and the reform is your sort of enthusiasm for and your confidence in language, right? So that this idea of conversations and discourse and narrative and voices seems to kind of underpin everything you're saying about a promise for reform. But you're dealing with an incredibly obdurate institution with an incredibly long history of kind of resisting those voices. So I wanted to segue a little bit into talking about generally about that, but also more locally about Francis, because this idea that he's urging the Catholic Church to quote unquote find a new balance, right, and to become less obsessed with abortion, gay marriage, contraception. And people have taken a lot of heart in the words that he's saying and the kind of promise that they offer for changes in the church. But there's also, I think, a great deal of skepticism about how far words can go. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, because this idea that sort of these ephemeral things floating in the world can be concretized into law and then enact real change because they're printed and they're there, right? You live by them. But there's also, as I said, a lot of history that suggests that that's difficult. So generally, how do you see language, or what do you see in addition to language making a change? And then what do you think about Francis's words? I mean, do you think they're really going to make a
I think tone matters. But can I just go back to where you started this, saying that this is an obdurate establishment with a very strong gravitational pull of tradition and a kind of a resistance to change. If we weren't talking about the church, we could be talking about Irish politics. So I've served an apprenticeship in another sphere. 900 years of conflict, 900 years of being told this conflict is irredeemable, it can't be resolved, it won't be resolved, can't be resolved. And then there comes a generation which looks like it's actually on the way to resolving it. And part of the resolution of it was also the use of new language. I would credit George Mitchell, funnily enough, with a lot of that, because growing up in a divided community, just as in the church, where we have a divided people, we have a hierarchy who speaks down and a laity that doesn't get listened to. So we learn ways of engaging with each other that miss each other by a mile. And similarly, in Northern Ireland, two communities lived cheek by jowl. We spoke the same language, but our language was informed by completely different perspectives. Protestants had one version of history, Catholics had another. We never stood in each other's shoes long enough to see the world as they saw it. And our discourse, our political discourse, was raw and angry and always point scoring and mean, and it always had the effect of making us angrier. Rather like how I've felt, I have to say, over the last two papacies. Being talked down to and talked over or ignored as a woman, and in particular in relation to gay rights. Let me give you a small cameo. I went to see the nuncio in Ireland, a young man called Charles Brown, who's a new nuncio in Ireland. And I went to... Well, the nuncio is the Pope's delegate or Pope's legate, Pope's ambassador to a particular country. Ours is this young man from Manhattan called Charles Brown. And when he arrived, I thought I would go and see him and talk to him about a number of issues, but one in particular that really I get very upset about. And it is this: the biggest killer of young men in Ireland between the ages of 15 and 25 is suicide. Not disease, not car accidents, not drug abuse, but suicide. And the biggest at-risk group within that category of 15 to 25-year-old males are young gay males. They have a very high incidence of self-harm, a very high incidence of suicide. The vast majority of them will have gone to Christian schools. The vast majority of those will have gone to Catholic schools, where they will have heard Catholic teaching, which they will have found a source of great inner conflict. And so I went and I said to him, look, is there some way pastorally that we can begin to address this in schools, to get a message to these children to be open, to talk, to not be afraid, because there are many of them very scared? And he looked straight at me and he said, what do you want us to do? You want us to change 2,000 years of tradition? And I said, actually, if it's wrong, yes, I do. Just in the same way that you were forced to change 2,000 years of teaching anti-Semitism that outcropped eventually in the Shoah. Yes, I do. just as I want you to change the teaching as the teaching was changed many years ago on that a child, an unbaptized child that died, could not go to heaven. That was changed. I mean, we change things that are wrong, and in order to change them, we have to listen, while new voices give us new insights. And there's a whole world of new insight now into gay identity, into sexual identity generally. And I want to see that argued about within the church, not in the civic space just, but actually in the church, and I don't see that. I just hear rehearsed. So I said that, so that's fine. So that's what you're up against, in a sense. And I go back to the question of Northern Ireland and Irish politics. The obduracy, the difficulty. Yes, difficult, but not impossible. And what I've learnt through the Northern Ireland peace process is that we can change people's hearts and minds by just relentlessly pushing for discourse and pushing for opportunities for that discourse. And then, little by little, introducing into that discourse new ways of dealing with it. George Mitchell is the classic case in point. That man had a tone and a temperament that was saintly. He came to Ireland as the emissary of President Clinton, special advisor, and he was incredibly dignified, always respectful. No matter how bonkers the stuff he had to listen to, he was always respectful. And believe you me, he has cornered the market in listening to bonkers. And yet he never reacted. He never said, that's bonkers, that's nuts, you know, how stupid is that? He always said, well, that's very interesting, I'll take that on board. Now, he may very well have closed the door and kicked a wall in frustration, but publicly, he always evinced a real respect for the people who were talking to him, no matter what they were saying. And he did that over a period of time so effectively that both sides started to believe. When he said that he was on nobody's side, they believed him. And when he said he was on everybody's side, they believed him. And little by little, his good example started to have an effect on the language. I could hear it. I'm listening every day to it. And I started to hear little words, just little suggestions. And obviously he was saying to them, look, if you tone down your language, if you aren't hurting people, you know, and digging always into the wound, maybe you might get a generous response from the other side. And little by little, he was able to persuade them that a slight change in tone, a slight generosity, could actually open up space for compromise. And over a period, it did exactly that. And so I believe, I wouldn't have gone into the presidency if I didn't believe that people could change. So how do we make them change? Well, you can force them to change. We can do the old battle thing and force people to capitulate at the end of a gun, sure. And that lasts until they get a gun and then they, return the compliment. Or you can do the humanly decent thing, which is to try and when you're dealing with sheer obduracy, when you're dealing with something that is monumentally stuck, to try and work the small spaces. Like when my husband and I started our building bridges in the president's home, we decided we wanted to make peace with our enemies. No point in making peace with your friends. Make peace with our enemies and hope your friends stay friends. And we started to engage with the Unionist community in Northern Ireland, many of whom would say to you they would not come to Dublin, and over their dead bodies would they come to our house. They were so contemptuous of us and what we stood for. And we wanted to befriend them. And what we did at the very beginning was, when we phoned them, my husband gave up his job as a dentist and sat on the phone phoning people, inviting them personally to our home. And if they said no, he'd say, fine, that's grand. But if they said yes, we would say to those people, come back the next time and bring 10 of your friends with you. And little by little, we started to widen the circle of people who would say yes. So that eventually, some of the people who'd said no at the beginning started to ring us up and say, will you invite us again? And that proved to me that there is a yesness in people But there's a decency and a goodness in people. And if what you're doing has integrity, if it has a rightness about it, and I think we are at the time in our church where there is a rightness about the debate about its structure and how it will involve the laity. We can see ourselves the diminishing quantities of priests in the Western world. And I take no great comfort from, I've been constantly told, oh, well, there are great vocations in Africa and India, and that's marvellous. Yeah, and 100 years ago it was the same story in Ireland, and we know how this story ends. So I'm looking at the church I'm living in, and I see it ageing, an ageing population of priests who get so little support now, and so little encouragement from around them, because everything around them seems to drain them. And I want them to be energized. I really want our good priests and our good religious to be energized again by a church that is actively engaged in listening up, not talking down. The days, frankly, of talking down to educated people are gone. They're just gone. You can't do it anymore. People will not be talked down to, particularly if you're talked down to people, by people whose judgment you do not trust. And that is what has happened to us, regrettably, in our church in Ireland. So that's what I think that we need to think about now. How do we get a listening up church?
Well, it's also interesting, I think, that the position that you're identifying in George Mitchell, right, has to do with his capacity to listen and his tone, right, and being able to move that compromising language. And that's sort of the same role that you see yourself having because you have canon law, right? That because you weren't sort of schooled in the norms of the priesthood, that you've been able to identify something important and different and come to it with a different tone, right, with a different perspective. So the outsider, in some ways.
I think the outsider's important.
Yeah, for change, absolutely. Yes. Which brings me to my...
Francis is quite an outsider. Quite an outsider. So I take comfort in that. Now, that is not to say that, it's also a dangerous space for him to be in as Pope. He has generated phenomenal goodwill. I mean phenomenal goodwill. I've never seen anything like it. Talking the other day to a former loyalist, that is, Ulster Protestant paramilitary, and he said to me, we were on the phone to him the other day, and he said, "We love Pope Francis." You what? We love, if you're talking to the Pope, tell him we love him. This is from a loyalist paramilitary, a kick the Pope guy. That's what he will have learnt from childhood, anti-papist songs. We love Pope Francis. So that's an amazing gift. And it's his gift, but it's also the gift of the Holy Spirit working through him, thank God. But in back of that, a tsunami of anticipation and expectation is forming. And he is going to have to deliver at least some of it, or be seen to be on the road to delivering it. Because there's nothing worse than building up, galvanizing that expectation, and then dashing it by non-delivery. And I know that from the experience in Ireland of the many attempts we had at peace processes that built up, and then not only delivered nothing, but delivered a kind of a valley of despondency in the wake of failure. Now, that's not to say that we learnt nothing from them, because sometimes failure is the very thing that teaches you, at the very least it teaches you what not to do the next time, which sometimes is quite useful. And we were able eventually to gather up all those failures and turn them into the Good Friday Agreement. But frankly, we wasted a lot of time. And we would have been better off in the early days talking to everybody. One of the reasons why we failed, incidentally, over many years was governments and others took positions that they would not talk to paramilitaries. Not talking, those people are terrorists, they are thugs, they are mindless terrorists. We don't talk to terrorists. Well, that's fine, except it's the terrorists, in the case of Ireland, who were out causing the problems. And they weren't mindless, they were purposive. They actually had ambitions, they had a destination they wanted to get to. Somebody was going to have to talk to them to persuade them that they were wrong. At the very least, that the destination they were trying to get to was a destination that couldn't be gotten to the way they were going, and that there might be an alternative strategy. So unless somebody engaged them in dialogue, they were only, a bit like our hierarchy, they were only ever listening to each other. And there was no fresh air flowing through the system. And we were very fortunate that we had a redemptorist priest, Father Alec Reid, who was visiting the Republican prisoners in prison in Ireland, in Northern Ireland. And he was listening to them and listening over years. Many people wouldn't visit them in prison. Many people wouldn't talk to them. You know, they were pariahs. But he listened. And then there came a moment when he realized, these guys are tired. These guys are tired. They are getting older. And they have realized that they cannot beat the British, and the British cannot beat them. We're on this kind of plateau, you know, catch-22. And in that moment, he realized that they were ready for a new kind of discourse, that somebody would have an opportunity in that tiredness to say to them, what about an alternative strategy now? You don't want your kids to spend their 30 years of their life in prison, so you're going to have to change the narrative here. Introduce something new, disrupt or rupture the old narrative. And he was the person then who very cleverly brought Gerry Adams and John Hume together in conversation. And John Hume was excoriated by everybody for talking to so-called terrorists. But what people failed to realise was John Hume was persuading them to this alternate strategy, and the strategy was build on peace. If you have something that is so valuable that you think that you'll expend your life and kill other people for it, why not talk about it openly? Why not make it a democratic cause? Why not persuade people with your words? And eventually that's exactly what happened. Gerry Adams was persuaded to the alternate strategy, which was the use of peace and the use of negotiation and compromise. And he in turn persuaded the IRA to go on ceasefire. Now, somebody had to do that work. Somebody had to change the tone, the temper, and the nature of the narrative. The important thing is somebody did, it was done, and history was changed. And I believe that's what happens. That's what happens. That's how change is effected.
It goes back to the point you made earlier about argument, right? I mean, that argument, as you said, whether you win or lose, you have the bravery and the commitment. And arguing is an act of love. You know, I mean, it's risk-taking and it's opening yourself up for change. But it's also terrifying. You know, even if you're an enormous institution, you know, if your friends on the playground are arguing over a pail of sand, it's scary if you're bored. You know, so it's also scary if you're this enormous institution.
Yes, and on the other hand, this institution that is the church is founded by Christ. And so it has at its base not just human fallibility, but divine infallibility. In the sense of, I shouldn't use the word infallibility because it's really the wrong word to use here. It has divine integrity. And so this is where I believe that if you look at the history of the institution, by right it should have been gone long ago. God knows it's made enough blunders to have shot itself in the foot so many times historically and has so many shameful episodes. Every so often, you know, when I hear people talking about, you know, how wonderful the church is and how sad these times are, I take them to the Campo di Fiore and I stand in front of the great Dominican Bruno and I tell the story of Bruno, you know, who was, sorry about the Jesuits, but I mean, actually, you weren't very nice to Bruno. You were not very nice to Bruno now. And as a Dominican girl, I'm still very raw about that. And here we had, you know, so we have a history that is, you know, has some wonderful stories in it and some absolutely god-awful, embarrassingly dreadful stories. And so the human frailty of our institution, I have no difficulty saying that. But I come out of again a time in Northern Ireland when both sides were so anxious to appear all right about everything that they could never admit to being wrong about anything. And again, the outsider in me, I'm perfectly happy to say we were wrong about things. On my side of the equation, Irish nationalists got many things wrong. My church has got many things wrong. But what we're trying to work towards is the full revelation of the power of the great commandment to love one another. And I believe we can do that. Why? Not because I trust the bishops to do it, but because I trust God to help us to do it. And I think we're very lucky at the moment to have a pope who looks like, you know, he might actually have been sent by God, or some version of God, obviously an Argentinian version of God. to help us. And I wish him, I really, really wish him well. I'm very much a wait-and-see person around popes. I was very encouraged by much of what he had to say, a little bit discouraged recently about what he had to say on the subject of women. I thought, again, the tone of what he said and the content was just a little bit backtracking on what he had said at the beginning. It sounded to me like a man who might be setting the parameters of an argument, which would not be surprising, because this is what our clergy do, this is what our bishops do. They set the parameters because they've been taught that that's what their job is. I'm saying, actually, no. You can set the parameters after you've had the debate. Have the debate, distill the evidence, and now you set the parameters of where you go. So I was a bit disappointed, I have to say. But maybe he got lost in translation, and that's always a possibility, because I was very much more encouraged by what he had said first about finding new roles and new ways of engaging women in the church.
I'd like to open it to questions. That's gone by awfully fast. We had our questions here, but I'll just ask, and just for questions, if people could keep them short, to do that at the center microphone.
Feel free to nudge each other awake.
Uachtaran gur maithagad.
Na habar céad fáilte rót.
Thank you. What we said was, thank you very much, President. And she said, don't mention that. And thank you for all you did for Ireland. In my view, you were the best of all our presidents so far. And all that you and your esteemed husband did, will live forever in our memories.
Thank you.
I'm from Kilkenny. And I also wanted to share with you what our mutual friend, Abbot Patrick Hederman of Glenstall, said, because you mentioned some of the things. He said there were 3 models of government in the church. The first was one you mentioned. It was where the pyramid model, where everything came down from the top and nothing went up from the bottom to the top. And the second model was the centrifugal model, where everything started at the center and spun out to the outside. And the third one, and I'm quoting Abbot Hederman, Benedictine Abbot of Glenstall, was the one adopted by Irish bishops, which was the mushroom model. And he said this in your presidency, so I think you have to take some responsibility for it. But he, about 2 years ago, and he said that the Irish bishops used the mushroom model was keep everybody in the dark and feed them a lot of shite. So I think what you're arguing for is to abandon that model and to do something else. Thank you for everything. Thank you for a wonderful talk, too.
We have some very interesting clerics in Ireland. We surely have. Actually, a strange thing, there is a model that I mention a number of times in the book, and that is, post-Vatican II, the people who took most seriously the need to reorganize their sources of government, their forms of governance, were very often the religious orders. And the religious orders drew into their discourse the whole concept of collegiality, and very often root and branch changed their structures so that you could have a situation at the end where you could say legitimately, nothing about us without us, nothing decided about us without us. And I think the religious orders in that respect have given huge leadership. They've also shown what is doable and how it's doable. I can think of many of them who have made that journey from old, rigid controller, hierarchical kind of structures, pyramidal structures, to much what we would call, I suppose, much more democratically shaped structures. Bearing in mind, I know that the church is not a democracy, but neither do I believe that Christ created a feudal autocracy.
Hi, my name is Sloan, and I was wondering, in your experience, I know you talked a lot about the governance of the church particularly, but I was wondering about the idea of separation of church and state, and if it was accurate to say that there really could be a separation, or if there's no way to really separate the two.
Yes, in the Irish experience, we had a historical situation where a minority church, that was the Anglican Church, became the confessional state church of our country, and attempted to evangelize by force the natives. We proved very heavily resistant in that regard. Subsequently, when the Irish state was founded, we had disestablishment and the creation of the separation of church and state prior to the division of our country. And then came a situation where the Irish Catholic Church was said in our constitution to have a special position. It wasn't a confessional state, but it was recognised as having a special position, and the religious liberty was guaranteed to everyone. But in the 1970s, I think people felt very strongly that even that suggestion, even that statement that we would have a special position for one church was untenable in a democracy, in a liberal democracy, and by referendum that went. Now, I believe very firmly in the separation of church and state, but I do not believe that both spheres should live in ignorance of one another, nor do I believe that they should live in the sense of, I don't think that one should run the other, essentially. No state should be governed by a church, and no church should be governed by a state. It's as simple as that. But churches are very important as they're very important civic organisations, and they have a very important place in everyday human discourse and political discourse. And I do think it's very important that the state give to those religious organisations, whatever they are, whether it's my church or any other church, whether it's people who are humanists or atheists, that they are given their space to enter the political arena and be part of political discourse. That, to me, is a very important thing also, that their voices are heard and they are not overlooked or ignored in the public space. So that's roughly, I do think that there is a huge merit in the separation of church and state. I think history shows us that where they have been intertwined, that it's always been corrosive, highly corrupting of church and very, very corrosive of state. Certainly my own lived experience living in Northern Ireland, which was a Protestant state for a Protestant people for a very long time, it was the downstream consequences in terms of human dignity and civil liberties was baleful and led to conflict, as inevitably it would. So I think everybody is safer. The world is a safer place when states have regard for the human rights of everybody, regardless of religion, and where religions are respected, fully respected by the state, and are given their place and their space to speak.
Madam President, can you hear me?
I do, I hear you, yes.
I feel like a carpetbagger since I'm from Boston College and I shouldn't be here. But, Madam President, one of the things that I had learned in my Jesuit education as I did my studies and master's studies there was a question of various types of activities that were understanding about truth and morality and the civility situations that occurred between the both. It also enunciated to me the capability to say, how do I act and reflect some of this training that I had as dialogue with young people? Because basically what happens in a dialogue situation with me now is the civility seems to lose its course a little bit, and we get into an emotional state, and then we get to a situation of it becomes non-sanctified, if you will. So what I would like to take an opportunity to hear how you, in your dialogue, both as a woman, both as a president, both as, if you want to call it, a very learned lady, to interact how would we best with the intercourse, the civility of argumentation, in order to come out with a result that we think would be most appropriate. So my question is, in your experiences, what tones or what methodology did you find most proficient in order to exercise this dialogue to give some sort of at least a partial answer, at least a civil answer?
I think that's a really important question. Thank you for it, because it's something that exercised my husband and I at the very beginning of our time in the presidency, when we had committed to bringing into our orbit and our home people who were and regarded themselves as, really very strong enemies of who we were and what we represented. People who didn't like Catholics, people who didn't like Irish nationalists, people who didn't like anything Irish, people who thought we were anti-British, who feared us. So these were the people we had to make peace with. These were, if you like, the enemy. And these were people who we believed in perpetuity were going to be our neighbours, and we would be as well to be neighbourly with them. But in the past, all discourse in a divided society, particularly between Christians, ends up being not a discourse really, but a really strong argument that is driven by a form of evangelism. We always debated with each other in a way that we would only be satisfied when the other thought as we did, if you like, converted. We were always about the business of converting people to our point of view. So very early on, my husband and I decided that if we were to make friends with people, if we wanted to have just simply be good neighbours, not to turn them into Irish nationalists or people who believed in a united Ireland, but people who believed what they would always continue to believe and what they believe right now, but people who nonetheless would be friends of ours, that we were going to have to find some way of engaging them in a discussion around a table that allowed us to befriend them and to build those friendships. So what we did was very simple. As people started to come to our home and sit down, first of all, we would sit them down, have a cup of tea, and we never discussed politics. We decided that it was important initially not to discuss the things that were too tough to discuss, because our experience had been exactly that things get very confrontational very quickly, and they lead to breakdown. And in the leading to breakdown, you don't have time to build up the human relationship that you need to be able to talk about the tough stuff. There's a lovely line in a poem, I'm not going to get it right, but it's a beautiful line in a poem by Micheál O'Shiel, and he talks about his marriage as being a series of patches, where the stitching of the patches has made the relationship stronger. And it's a beautiful idea that these patches, and each patch represents an argument, a dispute, a time of fragmentation or breakdown. So what we did was we brought these people to our home in large numbers. We're talking thousands now, thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And we said to them at the very beginning, simple things, no photographs. They could take photographs if they wanted of us, but we were never going to do the political thing of, here's a photo. This is not a photo op. We were serious of purpose. We wanted to build friendships, and we were never just going to meet them once. We were going to meet them on a sustained basis, and we sort of set out ground rules that eventually people grew to trust, so that the space they came into was a space they began to believe in. And we talked about children. We asked them about what their plans were for their kids. We asked them about their future. And we talked about our kids and their futures. And in the doing of that, we began to tease out the fact that we were pretty much agreed of the kind of world that we wanted for our children. And when we had built the relationship up, then we felt strong enough to be able to talk the tough stuff. And frankly, we heard things in that tough stuff that in other company might very well have led to breakdown. We had to listen to things that were at times abusive, that were at times provocative. But in the world of diplomacy, if you stop thinking about the ego, if you stop thinking about the I am hurt myself, and if you think about where you're trying to get to, the landscape of opportunity and peace you're trying to create for another generation, you have to let ego go, because quite frankly, very often that anger that is provoked by what you've just heard that you disagree with is simply a form of egoism or egotism. And we learnt to suppress that ego. And we learnt just simply to smile or to say back, well, I find that hard to listen to and I find that difficult, and here's how I would maybe respond to that. But we find ways, we find language, if you like, to keep the narrative and to keep the discourse going, because we knew that breakdown, we couldn't afford breakdown, basically. We'd had too much breakdown before, so we just parked ego. And I do agree with you. I think the temper of political discourse, I hear it here in this country too, has become really quite contemptuous. And that is not humanly good, because contempt feeds the ego of the other who is, the victim of the contempt. And then the danger is that you respond in contemptuous terms, and now you've got more contempt, and you vote. And now when you go to debate something sensible, you have all this wall of ego to try and get over before you can get to the hardcore point. And so I think that there is a very real need to raise this issue about how we engage with one another respectfully. And I actually think this is an issue too for our church, that our church has not always been very respectful of the voices that it has heard from the civic space, because it has closed off dialogue. And because we continue to speak, take, for example, the issue of women in priesthood. We were told that the debate was closed but within the church. But of course, the debate continued in the civic space. And as it was continuing in the civic space, those inside the citadel that was the clericalised church regarded a lot of that debate, as really quite hostile. And very often, if you have no other way of, if the civic space is the only place you have, you begin to sound like you're always lobbing bricks into the citadel. You begin to look like, somebody who has, and in order to be heard within the citadel, sometimes you have to shout very raucously. And that is also mutually disrespectful, which is why I think the walls of the citadel have to come down, so that we have a more normal discourse. It won't always be pleasant, and it won't always be, it might even be at times very harsh. But I think to let the air flow and to build, importantly at the beginning, to build friendships. I really believe that in all negotiations, particularly negotiations that are designed towards conflict resolution, forget for the time being the bones of the conflict, the things that are really, really, really tough, and focus on building up the personal relationships so that by the time you get to dealing with the tough stuff, you actually might like each other as human beings. The danger is if you meet to discuss the tough stuff first, and you're the Catholic and I'm the Protestant, and all Catholics are this and all Protestants are that, and that's just another Catholic and that's just another Protestant. The opportunity for breakdown, the possibility of breakdown, is just too real. And that's what we dealt with for a very, very long time. We didn't invest enough in what I might call respectful discourse.
I could go on with this conversation all night, and I'm really grateful for all the ways that you've helped us to think about how to carry on that conversation. That would have been my last question, but we do need to end because it's 8:50. Right. Thank you very much, Mary.
My pleasure. Thank you. And thank you for the questions. Thank you very much. Thank you.